promotion to professor. We were really fortunate when Ingo transferred his Royal Society University Research Fellowship back in, and I'm having to remind myself because it seems like a very long time ago, back in 2003. He moved over to Imperial College, and since he's been here, he's built up an important activity in the field of planetary atmospheres, and he's developed fantastic links with staff in the former Space and Atmospheric Physics group. In 2004, he was successfully appointed on a proleptic lectureship, and he then went on to be promoted to a reader in physics in 2008. So as you're going to find out tonight, he's very well known for his work on planetary atmospheres. And what he does is he uses a combination of numerical simulations and data from spacecraft, such as Cassini-Huygens, Venus Express, ExoMars, and JUICE, which is now successfully on its way to Jupiter and its moons. And his focus is really to lead efforts in understanding how the solar wind interacts with the atmospheres around the different planets and the moons in our solar system. He's co-principal investigator of the radio and plasma wave instrument on board ESA's JUICE spacecraft mission, which, as I've said, is now on its way to Jupiter. But in addition to his research, we were really fortunate when he took up the position of senior tutor for the department back in 2018 until reasonably recently, until earlier this year. This, of course, coincided with the COVID pandemic, and it had significant implications on everybody, including our students and our teaching. And the commitment he gave to the role and the knowledge and the empathy that he showed to the students and the staff were really critical in enabling the department to get through what was a really difficult time. His really great contribution hasn't ended there on the teaching front. He's now the faculty senior tutor. But before I give the floor to Ingo so we can hear about his work, I've got some housekeeping I need to describe to you. If a fire alarm goes off, it's not planned, so it means it's a proper one. So we will need to leave the lecture theatre, and the staff in the room will know where to go, and it's on the corner of Exhibition Road and Imperial College Road. Those of you online will be able to submit questions on the side of the screen. Keep in mind the event is being recorded though, so if you don't want your name to be read out, you can put the questions online without your name linked to them. But with that, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Professor Ingo Mueller-Wodarg to tell us about the wonders of the atmosphere across the solar system. Ingo. So I know how long I can let you talk.
Yes, and I need to turn on my timer. So thank you very much for your very generous words, Michelle, thank you. And thank you all in the room for being here today, for sacrificing an hour in your afternoon on a Wednesday for being here. And a huge thanks also to everybody who's joining us online. There are many very dear friends and colleagues joining us online from this side of the pond and the other side of the pond. So I'm really grateful that you are all here today. I will try and deliver some enthusiasm, hopefully, about the work that I've been carrying out for the last 20 years. I'm not going to go into much detail, and I can only give you a glimpse because time is not on my side, and I will have to limit myself. So the topic of my research are atmospheres on planets, so planetary atmospheres. And more specifically, I look at the upper regions of the atmospheres, where basically the atmospheres interact with the solar wind. If you don't know what any of this means, I'm going to give you a brief background, hopefully brief background. And then I will basically talk about the main physics question that I want to address of what physical processes drive these upper atmosphere layers. And I'm going to look at three specific examples: Venus, Titan, and Saturn. And it's probably, I overpromised in the title, you thought you would get the whole tour of all the planets and moons of the solar system. So I timed myself, and I'm not going to be able to do that. Okay, so what is an atmosphere? Well, an atmosphere in the context that I'm looking at today, is basically a gas layer surrounding a planet or a moon, one which is gravitationally bound. So that means the gravity of the planet or moon has to be large enough to retain the atmosphere. Otherwise, it escapes into place. So I'm talking about permanent atmospheres. And in those gravitationally bound atmospheres, we have they follow the hydrostatic law, which means that the pressure at any level where you are in the atmosphere is equal to the weight per surface area, per unit surface, of the atmosphere above. So the higher you go up in the atmosphere, the less atmosphere you have in the column above you, and therefore the lower the pressure. So pressure decreases exponentially as you move up. Secondly, density also decreases exponentially, and that is simply because gases are compressible, and which means the ones down below, under the pressure of the atmosphere above, those gas molecules are closer together, so the density per volume area, per volume unit, is larger lower down than higher up. So these are just two fundamental things. You can look at, for example, temperature profiles of atmospheres. I'm showing here in this diagram a typical temperature curve of the Earth's atmosphere. And you can basically, using the temperature profile, subdivide the atmosphere into different layers: troposphere at the bottom, stratosphere, mesosphere, and thermosphere above. And the region that I'm interested in my work is the upper atmosphere, which consists of the mesosphere and thermosphere. Up here, I put a little sign what the pressure is at 250 kilometers in the thermosphere of Earth, and it's 25 micropascal, which is less pressure than you could produce in a normal lab vacuum, which means there's almost nothing up there. So you would say, am I spending my life studying nothing? And you would be justified to think so. So I'm not trying to make sense of this nothing. Part of the upper atmosphere, despite its low density, it's very important, and part of it is ionized, so that we are actually above us, there's a layer of plasma. And this here on the right is just a curve showing you electron densities versus height, and at the peak, roughly one part per thousand of the atmosphere is ionized. This is important because it affects how the atmosphere interacts with the space environment. You can then look across the solar system and plot the temperatures versus, in this case, pressure, which is the more fundamental unit to use instead of altitude. And you see for different planets that the temperature curves are remarkably similar. The sort of regions overlap in terms of pressure very nicely, and this says something about the fundamental physics driving them. It's one thing to highlight: the Earth's upper atmosphere here, at the top, is the hottest of them all, and that is despite the fact that Earth is not closest to the sun. Venus is closest to the sun, but its upper atmosphere is pretty cold. And also we have some quite hot planets out there, Uranus and Jupiter. They are far from the sun, and they're also the hottest. So this shows you that the temperature in the upper atmosphere is not dominated only by the sun's radiation. Okay, so this is just a cartoon showing you the region I'm talking about. The blue is the upper atmosphere layer. It sits on the lower atmosphere, which is this region here, and out here is the space. And what I'm going to, basically both of these, it's sandwiched between these two regions, and both of them affect the upper atmosphere. From below, you get mostly atmospheric waves propagating upward, affecting the momentum and energy balance here. And from above, you have solar radiation, partially ionizing the atmosphere. You have fast electrons and ions precipitating in from outer space. And all of this accompanied by electrical and magnetic fields, and those in turn accelerate plasma of the atmosphere. So it's a zoo of competing processes, and that's what makes this so exciting. And the central question that I'm asking today is basically, what is the balance between the effects from above and from below? Because that kind of is what shapes what the upper atmospheres look like. The answer is it depends. So I guess we're done now. All right, I will tell you a bit more why it depends. Okay, so a little bit more about the physical processes. I mentioned atmospheric waves a short while ago. Well, waves, you know them from oceans. They propagate horizontally or on lakes. But in the atmosphere, they also propagate vertically. And because of the decrease of density with height, which I mentioned earlier, the amplitudes of these waves increase the more they move up. This is because you have to conserve momentum, one of the fundamental physics laws. So the amplitudes of waves increase. They start off as a small oscillation below, increase as they go up, and then they reach a critical value where basically the atmosphere can no longer sustain the wave. And then they break, or they dissipate, they fizz out. The important thing is all the momentum and the energy that the waves were carrying is then deposited up here. You know this a little bit from the beach. When the waves of the ocean come in, they basically fall over themselves and they sort of fizz out on the beach. And in a way, many waves end up in the upper atmosphere, and you can sort of look at the upper atmosphere as your beach for all the stuff that's coming up from below. And at the same time, you have the influences from above, from space. Well, what is space? Space is basically dominated by a stream of plasma that comes from the sun, which is called the solar wind. It's part of its upper atmosphere, thrown out into space. When the solar wind, this is sort of shown in this animation, which is constantly cycling, making everybody nervous probably by now. So the solar wind goes towards Earth, but it cannot just hit the planet because Earth has a magnetic field, illustrated by this. And the plasma cannot move through the magnetic field, so it gets diverted around it. And the magnetic field of Earth forms a bubble around the planet, which we call a magnetosphere. Through processes which could take hours to explain in more detail, basically what happens as the solar wind interacts with the magnetosphere, ultimately electrons are accelerated towards the planet, towards the upper atmosphere, and they are channeled towards the poles. And so what happens then here at the poles is that they create, for example, northern lights or aurora. At the same time, they create heating. So this is how it works on Earth. Something similar happens on Saturn, which I'll talk about later, but it works in a different way. So here, basically, the energy coming from above ultimately comes from the solar wind. Right, so I move on. Okay, how do we explore the space? Basically, two fundamental categories. Either we look at it, we do observations, or we simulate it, and we do calculations. So observations can either be with a ground-based telescope, or they can be with a satellite. And with a satellite, you can then either look at a planet or an atmosphere remotely, or you actually go there and you fly through the atmosphere and you sample gases locally. So that's the in situ. And I was on one of the experiments on the Cassini orbiter. We actually flew through the atmospheres. I will talk about this in a while. My personal focus has been on the simulation side. And I have over the years developed, in collaboration with colleagues in the US as well, models for Saturn and Titan. I'm currently working on a Jupiter model, and my PhD was on an Earth model. What do these models do? Basically, they solve numerically the fundamental equations, Navier-Stokes equations of continuity, energy, and momentum, conservation laws. These are nonlinear, coupled nonlinear partial equations. And to give myself a bit of credibility, I'm listing one here. You always need one equation in the talk, right, to get credibility. So this is the energy equation. It shows you a change of energy per time interval. And on the right side, all kinds of forcing, all kinds of processes. And because we solve them numerically and not analytically, we can add anything we want here. That makes sense, of course. And so this is how you integrate these kind of equations. There are the other two as well. And that's ultimately what you end up is with global profiles of temperatures and velocities and composition for both neutral gases and ions. So this interplay between charged particles and neutrals, for that you need the models. Okay, and recently I did a little experiment, really simple, but the beauty of it is I think you learn so much from it. So I just took a simple model, a simple case, let's say a Saturn, that's shown here on the left as my sort of hybrid Saturn, which is without a magnetosphere or anything, just a planet, and I let it be heated by the sun. It is at a distance of Saturn, almost 10 astronomical units from the sun, and it rotates at the standard Saturn rotation rate, once every 10.6 hours. How would the temperatures and winds look like in the upper atmosphere? Well, I simulated this, and this is the image you see here. This is versus local time and latitude. This is the South Pole, that's the North Pole. If you're not familiar with this, if you take the temperature map and put it on a globe, it will look like this. Okay, so these two are equivalent. So what you see in a simple Saturn case is that the equator is the warmest and the poles are the coldest. In reality, it's actually the other way around because of the magnetosphere, but we get into that later. And the wind speeds are a moderate 10-ish meters per second. The interesting thing here is you almost have no local time variation in temperature, and that's because of the heat capacity of hydrogen. This is a hydrogen planet, and it takes a long time to lose its heat over the night, but this is a fast-spinning beast, so you never have enough time to cool down, okay? Now, so what I did in my next experiment is I just slowed it down by a factor of 10, so now the rotation period is 106 hours, and now you see a very well-pronounced day-night structure, cold at night, warmer at day, kind of what you would expect. It looks completely different in shape, and the winds are also different because there you have less Coriolis forces and so on. We're not going to get into that. Wind speeds are also higher. So this is an interesting difference to realize. By the way, here on the top, these are the temperatures normalized that I took at the equator, and it shows you these three cases normalized to their average values. Now, the third case is that you take Saturn and you move it close to the sun. This is what we get with exoplanets, extrasolar planets. And there you have, again, very similar shape to this, but now the temperatures are a factor of 10 higher, and the wind speeds are in the order of a kilometer per second. And also the day-night difference is higher. In this case, that's because now you have infrared cooling playing a role as well in the higher temperatures. But anyway, what do you learn from these cases? You learn that basically you can explore. It's useful when you look at the detailed physics of these experiments. You learn so much more than if you just look at one in isolation. If I just looked at this, you learn a bit, but not that much. You actually have to play around to see, different boundary conditions give you a different scenario. Why is that? And that's how you really learn this. And the broad message is also you need to observe not just one planet, but many planets to actually get to know them. This is a nice little thing, Venus, about planet Venus. In the late 1970s, people made simulations of the Venus upper atmosphere. This was in preparation for the Pioneer Venus spacecraft. That was a NASA mission. And the models predicted, similar to what I showed you earlier, sort of a global profile of temperatures. And that's shown by this solid line here. And they basically predicted a day-night temperature difference of about 150 Kelvin on Venus. When they actually took the measurements, it turned out to be much higher. It was 200 Kelvin. So obviously the models didn't get it right, and they rarely ever do. But this is where it gets interesting. It turned out that the models, they have a finite grid. So you cannot resolve fine processes, like small-scale turbulence. You cannot resolve that. And it turns out that this is extremely important because it acts as a friction, as kind of a brake to the winds. So what happens here is from the day to the night, the winds blow in both cases. On the night side, they have to go down For the return flow then, to close the cell, they have to go down on the night side. And as they go down, they basically heat the gases below. This is called adiabatic heating. You know this from a bicycle pump. When you press the cylinder, it heats up. And so this adiabatic heating on the night side was what caused this relatively moderate initial day-night temperature difference. But if you then slow down the winds, you basically reduce this heating on the night side, and then you increase the temperature difference. So without going into any more details, the bottom line of this experiment was that basically this made people discover that there's a lot of friction, so-called Rayleigh friction, in the Venus atmosphere. And so it illustrates the principle that the models actually allow you to discover more science than if you had just looked at the measurements. Because you discovered, okay, the measurements don't fit what we think the physics is like, so you add more physics. And so that's how you the two always have to go together, the observations and the simulations. So I'm trying to kind of sell my usefulness, right? In a blunt way. Anyway, okay, and just Venus very briefly. I was fortunate to lead one experiment on the ESA Venus Express spacecraft. We made the first ever measurements of atmospheric densities in the polar regions of Venus. And we found that they had previously been predicted, extrapolated from other measurements. But we found that they were actually much lower densities than previously thought. And also the temperatures were much colder than previously thought. And the other nice result was we found lots of atmospheric waves. And that is what you need in order to explain this friction. So this was a nice little thing. I'm just showing you one slide on that and need to move on. Titan. Titan is the largest moon of Saturn, and it's an extraordinary body in the solar system. It's the only moon known to have a substantial atmosphere. If you stand on the surface of Titan, you would experience an atmospheric pressure larger than here on Earth, 1.5 bars. It's an atmosphere made of nitrogen and methane. There's not much oxygen there, so you wouldn't survive for very long. If you look at Titan, you see you basically see nothing but a yellow, fuzzy kind of thing. And that's because the atmosphere is filled with a global layer of haze, atmospheric haze, or in other words, smog. And this is just the presence of this haze is interesting on its own. The chemists are going wild on this. Basically, there's a whole chain of chemistry which was discovered with Cassini, initiated in the upper atmosphere. So the upper atmosphere is important. I'm trying to bring that across. The upper atmosphere, the molecules are broken apart, and then basically they reassemble into giant molecules, a bit like taking Lego bricks and just putting big structures together. And they then rain down, and this is why we don't see the surface on Titan, unless we look in specific wavelength windows. And finally here, something to highlight, the atmosphere of Titan is very extended. In the middle here, you see the solid body, and this ring around it, that's the upper atmosphere. It's basically half the size of the solid body itself. So it's a very interesting body, and it's a treasure trove that keeps on giving. And this was a book I was involved with a few years ago, and right now we're just finishing another book on Titan. So anyway, it's a wonderful place to study. Right. So one of the first glimpses we got of Titan's atmosphere was when the Huygens probe, which was sort of piggybacked onto the Cassini spacecraft, landed on the surface in January 2005. This here down here is a movie of actual images. They've been stabilized because they were going all over the place. This was shaking and turning and everything. So this is, and up here, this is just an animation showing what happened. Basically, it flew down and then with parachutes and so on. There's so much to say about the surface of Titan with open lakes of methane. It's a fantastic world to study. But I just want to highlight the boring part of this slide, the atmospheric profile, the temperature profile. Basically, this is the only continuous top to bottom temperature profile that we got for Titan's atmosphere. And so you see the familiar regions, but also you see lots of atmospheric waves on Titan, and they're going to be very important, as I will show to you a little later. So once Huygens had landed on the surface, that was over. The Cassini orbiter that had carried the sort of the mothership kept on orbiting Saturn for another 12 years. And as it did this, it regularly flew through the upper atmosphere of Titan. And there was an instrument on the orbiter called the Ion and Neutral Mass Spectrometer, or INMS, and I was part of that team. And we basically took measurements of the gases. From those, you can then derive the temperatures. And this is a plot we recently produced that shows you the gray lines are individual temperature measurements in the atmosphere. And it's just a total mess. They're all over the place. The black lines are the average ones. So the average looks civilized, but the rest is just total chaos. So Titan's upper atmosphere is highly, highly variable, more than anything anybody had expected. That's one puzzle. What's creating this? The other puzzle is another observation made after Cassini by a telescope, a ground-based telescope, the ALMA Observatory. And they looked at Doppler lines, at spectral lines of different specific gases listed here, and the Doppler shift of these lines. And by doing that, they could basically derive what the wind speeds would be like on Titan in the upper atmosphere. And these are the first ever direct measurements of wind speeds in the upper atmosphere. And this wasn't possible with Cassini, but you needed this ground-based telescope for it. And they showed, this is latitude here, this is altitude, a huge jet, a big jet at the equator of Titan, almost 400 meters per second. That's huge. And nobody knows what created this, what is causing this. So these two things, those are problems that I hooked onto, and I'm determined to solve them. So back to my models. In the pre-Cassini days, when we only had 2 atmosphere profiles and the world was at peace, we thought we understood Titan. We only had 2 profiles, everything made sense. And so I did, I developed a model before Cassini and basically plotted temperatures like the ones you saw earlier, these simulations. And basically my simulations predicted that the day side would be about 140 degrees Kelvin, the night side would be maybe 135. Nice and peaceful, nothing special. A few years later, looking at the end, the outcome, these down here are the observations, and superimposed is this blue area superimposed here. And you see that the data are all over the place. The temperatures on the day side here, the left side is the day side, the right is the night side. The temperatures on the day and night side are almost the same, but there's no consistency there. They're all over the place. So this again highlights the strong variability. This is kind of a different version of that vertical spaghetti plot I showed earlier. So I was determined to look into this. So my model is the so-called Titan TGCM, Titan General Circulation Model, which looks at which calculates the mesosphere and thermosphere region, the upper atmosphere. And a colleague of mine, Claire Newman, in the US, she had a Titan stratosphere model, Titan WRF model, as it's called. And it happens that the upper boundary of her model coincides with the lower height of my model. And this here shows you an animation of output from her model. These are temperature maps as a function of longitude and latitude. They're nice and variable. There's a lot going on here. The variations aren't huge. It's a few degrees here, but something is happening. Okay, so some action. So basically, I came up with the scheme to couple these 2 models that they exchange values at about 400 kilometers. And this is what you get. These are, so what is this? These are temperatures and zonal winds. Zonal are the east-west winds versus latitude here and versus pressure. So basically something like height. And this here is the interface region down there. You can barely, on this color scale, you can barely see what's going on there. It seems almost stagnant, but this is the region which had these variations that I showed you earlier. Despite this being seemingly low, this creates big havoc higher up, which is great. So basically, these tiny oscillations down there, because of the decrease of density with height, and because Titan is a slowly rotating body, which means there's no messy Coriolis forces or anything, this allows perturbations from below to very effectively propagate up. So the temperature oscillations are all over the place up here, and the winds as well. So how does that compare with these observations I showed earlier? This here is, again, the left side is the diagram I showed you, the temperature observations. And now on the right, you see the simulations. The black lines here, those are basically a whole zoo of vertical profiles across the body, which were taken just from a simulation that ignores the stratosphere. Let's pretend the stratosphere doesn't exist. It's just nothing going on down there. And so these are just the ones forced in situ by the solar heating. And those are much smaller than these ones, the black ones. But then the gray ones, those are the ones from the simulation where you allow the stratosphere to come through. And there you see a huge variability in the temperatures building up. And we're getting not quite to this level of variability, but we're getting close. So that's exciting. We also have lots of atmospheric waves on Titan. I showed you that Huygens atmosphere profile at the beginning, this temperature profile. From that, I extracted just the oscillations, the waves, and you see this very nice profile. These are temperature waves, observations on the left side, and this typical behavior that you expect from waves. The amplitudes increase, they reach a critical value, and then they decrease and just fizz out. And this is the region where you would then expect all this energy and momentum to be dumped into the atmosphere. And this is at around 900 kilometers. So let's look at the simulations on the right. Well, you have exactly the same thing. The waves propagating up, maximum, and then decreasing again. The simulated waves are softer and more benign than the actual ones. But there's a consistency also in terms of vertical wavelength. Okay, so now let's go back to this question of the jet, that famous jet. Does that come out in these simulations? Well, if I just ignore the stratosphere, there's no jet here. This is just tiny winds, 10, 15 meters per second. If you add the forcing from the stratosphere from below, what do you get? A beautiful jet. In the middle of the thermosphere, centered around the equator, the maximum wind speed is only about 100 meters per second versus 400. But later observations, taken 9 months later by the ALMA telescope, showed the winds to be much weaker. They were about half, if I remember right, 200 meters per second. So they're highly variable, these jets. And so we're getting into the ballpark. And most importantly, it shows the principle that if you consider the forcing from below on Titan, you get much closer to the observations. And that's the exciting part of it. Okay, moving to the final planet of this grand tour through the solar system. It hasn't been so grand, but anyway, this grand science, let's put it that way. Okay, Saturn. There's so much to say about Saturn. I only have 10 minutes left. What is interesting about Saturn, apart from the rings that everybody knows, is that it has a gigantic magnetosphere. I showed you at the beginning this animation of the Earth with its magnetosphere, this bubble around Earth. Saturn has that bubble too, a much bigger, larger bubble. And the way the interaction works between the planet and the magnetosphere is that basically the magnetosphere wants to rotate with the planet, but then some of these tiny moons of Saturn, some of them, which some people have discovered, throw geysers into the system. So some of the small moons constantly dump material out into the magnetosphere. And this is neutral material, so the magnetic field doesn't care. but then at some point they get ionized. So all of a sudden you have plasma, and when you have plasma and magnetic fields, they want to talk to each other. And so this plasma that is now added, the new mass in the solar system, has to be also brought up to speed to rotate at the same speed as Saturn. This distortion in the magnetic field then ultimately leads to electrical currents flowing between the magnetosphere into the atmosphere and back again. And they hit the atmosphere here at the magnetic poles, and they cause auroral emissions, these northern lights, and they also cause a lot of heating, which is called Joule heating. That's the same kind of heating you get when you have a current flowing through a cable, a bit too strong current flowing through a cable, and the cable getting hot. That's the same kind of heating. There are currents flowing through the ionosphere, which is not perfectly conducting, and they basically heat up the poles. At the same time, there are electric fields that go against the sense of rotation, because ultimately the magnetosphere extracts all its angular momentum from the atmosphere via the upper atmosphere. So, end result is you have strong circular westward against the sense of rotation winds and very strong heating, this Joule heating. Now the Joule heating, I said earlier, also happens on Earth. So it's useful just to compare the Joule heating rate to the other heating rate. What is the obvious other heating rate? That's the local solar heating. And if you look at Earth, the heating rate integrated of the planet is about 500 gigawatts. That's just the upper atmosphere absorption. The Joule heating rate is about 80 gigawatts. So it's less than 20% of the Joule heating is less than 20% of the solar heating. On Saturn and on Jupiter, the balance flips. The Joule heating is much larger than the solar heating. And so this, I just refer back to that original plot which showed these distant planets being so hot. Well, maybe this is where that comes from. And just a note to the physicists among you, you think, okay, the magnetosphere, where does it get its energy from? So you have to be careful, where does the energy ultimately come from? The Earth's magnetosphere gets its energy mostly from the solar wind, and Saturn and Jupiter are more rotation-dominated systems. So they basically, ultimately, it's the friction, it takes the energy out of the planet rotation. So that's what heats the upper atmosphere. Okay, now, what happens? If you heat the poles, you would expect this heat just to be nice and distribute evenly over the planet, right? But this is not what happens, because these are fast-rotating planets, Saturn and also Jupiter, all the giant planets. And now here the left is looking at it from above, from the North Pole. The planet rotates here anti-clockwise, and then if you have a hot pole, and the winds try to go towards the equator, there's the Coriolis force that diverts them into a circular wind. So nothing can really propagate from the pole to the equator. The energy is trapped in the poles. And if you then compare these to the observed temperatures, which is here at the bottom, the observed temperatures are pretty much uniformly 400, 500 degrees Kelvin. But they're not colder at the equator, whereas the modeled ones are. Ouch. Okay, something is going on. This is referred to as the giant planet energy crisis, and it has been a mystery for several decades. So, what's the solution that we came up with to resolve this? There are many theories about what could cause this. People have speculated whether the waves, which are abundant on Saturn, whether they could basically heat up the low latitude, they're propagating up, could they just heat up the low latitude region? But this doesn't work. If you look at through the theory, the heating rates, it doesn't work. But we have plenty of energy near the poles, so it becomes a different problem. You have to look at the same problem in a different way. How can we use the polar energy and just redistribute it? It becomes an energy redistribution problem, so a fluid dynamical problem in the end. So I showed you Venus at the beginning, friction, Rayleigh friction. Well, let's see what that does on Saturn. And if you consider this atmospheric friction again, so I'm highlighting this with this yellow dashed, this is sort of an area where we impose some friction in the atmosphere. What happens is that these strong zonal winds, they get slowed down. And that unlocks this barrier, this wall that trapped the energy near the poles. And if you just slow them down a bit, you get lots of winds blowing towards the equator and heating up the equator. So in a simulation like this, you get this temperature behavior, the solid line, before you had this dashed line, okay? So maybe this is maybe the riddle that solves that problem. Like I said, it's been a very persistent problem in planetary science. What would cause the friction? Well, basically local turbulence, but also atmospheric waves. There are plenty of them. I'm just showing an illustration there near the top right. Okay, so to kind of slowly wrap up, I'm doing on time, wow. To slowly wrap up, I just wanted to I came up with this idea, you know, we know what the key physical processes are on different bodies in the solar system. But then what is their relative importance? And so I just picked 4. There are many more. So one is, how important is the sun? And by sun, I mean locally, this local solar absorption. And this is only from the perspective of the upper atmosphere, temperatures and winds, the thermosphere. How important is the sun to the thermosphere? How important is the effect of the magnetosphere? How important are the waves that come up from below? And how important in shaping the thermosphere is the rotation rate? And so I have a little low to high importance scale, bit like a tune board. And for Earth, you can say, well, the sun is the king. Sun is really very important. Locally, the magnetosphere is also important, but not that much. Waves play a role in the lower thermosphere, and the rotation rate, I would say, plays some role, but it's not so much. In Venus, it's also the sun, magnetosphere not present, and waves and rotation rate are very important features that shape the thermosphere. And then you can continue playing this game for Titan and for Saturn, and of course, for Saturn, the magnetosphere is very important, and also the rotation rate I gave a red, because the fact that it's such a fast rotating planet, that's what creates this temperature problem, the temperature redistribution problem. So basically, with a combination of models and observations, we can complete this picture for the rest of the solar system. And it just shows you the message I said at the beginning. You need to look at many bodies and planets in order to be able to really understand how they work. And then what is next? Well, the next big target is Jupiter. There's currently a spacecraft in orbit around Jupiter, a NASA spacecraft called Juno, and I'm starting to link up with the Juno teams because I've already started work on a Jupiter thermosphere, ionosphere model. And so, and the nice thing about doing this after Saturn is that we have learned so much about Saturn from the Cassini mission that now we can employ this knowledge to another planet, which is broadly similar with all differences in mind, but there are many similarities. So we are applying the knowledge from Saturn to inform how we approach the Jupiter case. And yes, and then of course, Michel mentioned it at the beginning, this JUICE mission, that's a European mission going to Jupiter, which launched in April this year and will arrive in 2031. Right, and then finally, I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for a number of very, very broad shoulders that I stand on. And so I'm going a bit back to my school days, because I had two very inspirational teachers, my physics teacher and my maths teacher. Both kind of got me into science in the first place. I'm still in touch with my physics teacher, and he's watching us tonight as well, I think. And then I have many very dear colleagues, past and present, who have enormously affected my work, and on who I'm indebted to all of them. So I want to acknowledge all of that they have done. And to the right, I also want to acknowledge my current close collaborators, Jacob Parrott, my PhD student, and Peyo Inurigado, who sits over there with actually the same T-shirt. Okay, so I think I'm done, and thank you again, everybody in the room and online, for being here and for having spent your afternoon, your precious afternoon, watching this. Thank you.
So we've got time for some questions. Peyo, you're going to take questions online, so I think we're going to alternate. We'll have questions from people in the audience, and we'll wait for someone brave enough to put their hand up. And while they do that, let me say that was a fantastic talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes,
Thank
please.
You.
We have a question in the middle there. And we've got someone on each side of the room to walk around. It should just work.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you very much for that talk. Would you mind bringing up the first slide that you put on?
The first?
Yes, please.
Not the title, right?
Oh, no, the second.
Oh, the second.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, gosh, it's going to take a while. This one?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Just a simple question.
Yeah.
I would have thought that the temperature would go the other way. So as you come down in altitude, the temperature should go up, shouldn't it?
You mean the temperature should go up?
Yes.
Okay. What I didn't point out is that the upper atmosphere, the thermosphere, is extraordinarily hot. You see, this is like 1,000 degrees Kelvin. But that's basically because there's such a low gas density. You have a lot of energy heating up the region, but the energy is distributed over few particles, so that's why they get very hot. If you actually, I mean, this is the region where astronauts fly in space, and spacecrafts, and the International Space Station flies at these heights. Why don't they get fried? Well, because the density is so low, so it doesn't affect them. Whereas the deeper you go, first of all, you hit a lot of atmosphere. So the energy that you have needs to be distributed over a lot of mass. And therefore, the temperatures, first of all, go down. And then you have all kinds of gases down here, for example, CO2, carbon dioxide, which is very effective at radiating energy back out into space. So when you heat up this region, it just gets cooled down immediately by CO2, which is here but not up here. And then ozone is what heats up the stratosphere. And the surface, near the surface, the temperature increases. So the troposphere, this is where the airplanes fly, roughly where my pointer is. So it, from the surface up, it decreases. It's heated by the ground, largely, and it it decreases at the adiabatic rate, lapse rate, and then it increases. So the surface temperatures are fortunately around 300 Kelvin and not 1,000 Kelvin. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Can we have an online one?
Yes, we have. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we have one asking if Earth is unique in having such a large iron core that magnetic fields, that larger magnetic fields plus a relatively small size for its mass helps with stabilizing the atmosphere versus solar wind.
Okay, sorry.
Gosh, it's clearly an expert online.
Okay. Oh my God.
If Earth is unique in having such large iron core that larger magnetic fields plus a relatively small size for its mass helps with stabilizing the atmosphere versus solar wind.
Okay, so I'm not 100% sure I understood everything.
Do you want to go and read the question?
Shall I read it? Sorry.
It could be here a while.
Okay. Okay. Is Earth unique in having such a large iron core from the moon and larger magnetic field plus a relatively small size for its mass? Okay. Right. Okay. So.
You see, Ingo, I gave you lots of time to think
yes.
of the answer.
All right. Oof. That's a tough one. The Earth's atmosphere is very thin. So in that sense, the atmosphere, I mean, compared to Titan, it's a very thin layer. It's only about a few hundred kilometers versus 6,000 kilometers its radius. The magnetic field is basically, the iron core in the Earth creates a certain strength of magnetic field, which is strong enough to basically divert the solar wind. Is it unique? Well, yes, it is in a way unique. Every body is unique. Every planet body is unique, and every body too. I'm not sure I'm answering this properly, but I would say yes, there is a uniqueness about it, but it's not unexpected that the Earth is the way it is. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Good enough.
Good enough.
Good enough.
Okay, let's move on.
Yes.
Sorry.
Sorry, you're walking up and down, but four rows from the front. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a significant differential in the rate of escape of lighter noble gases from Earth's upper atmosphere as opposed to Venus. According to Zarni's figures from the 70s or 80s, there's 32 times as much neon in Venus's atmosphere relative to the Earth, and there's about something like 200 times as much helium. Is that due to the fact that a region where the Earth's lower ionosphere is quite hot, Venus is relatively cold, so monatomic species can find it more difficult to escape?
Your main question is about the ionosphere being cold, or what do you mean?
I'm postulating it as a reason for this differential significant, because we look at the atmospheres as a whole. Most of Venus's atmosphere is CO2. Corresponding on Earth, it's geologically deposited, and there's only about twice as much nitrogen. So the differential, what the question is, why is this huge differential in the amounts of lighter noble gases? Not so much the heavier ones, you wouldn't expect them to escape necessarily anyway.
Are you asking why is Venus colder than Earth?
No, I'm just wondering if that's the reason, or if there's been some confirmation of what I just said, some way of actually demonstrating, either in terms of modelling or direct measurements.
Okay, at the beginning you mentioned escape, right?
Yes.
Atmospheric escape. As atmospheric escape happens to some extent on Earth, on Venus, on most planets, but it's insignificant. You can forget it. And it has no influence energetically. It doesn't cool down the atmosphere in any way. The reason that Venus is so cold, even though it's close to the sun, is that its atmosphere is CO2. And I mentioned earlier, CO2 is effective at radiating things out, energy out. So when you have a hot CO2 atmosphere, it loses its energy immediately. And it's the composition of the main gas of the atmosphere that determines its temperature to a large extent. So it's radiatively very active, Venus.
So, just like,
Maybe the two of you can have a detailed conversation over a
thanks
glass of wine.
Yeah, over a wine.
thank you for
Yeah.
that.
Okay. Yes, please, Peter.
Yes, we have another one online asking, does tidal heating ever play an important role in determining the temperature or stability of an atmosphere?
The first bit I didn't understand.
Does tidal heating ever play an important role in determining the temperature or stability of an atmosphere?
Of an atmosphere or any specific one?
No, in general, an atmosphere.
Okay, so tidal heating, so heating by atmospheric tides, is that what they're saying? Okay, so does the heating of upward propagating wave play an important role, I guess is the question. And I would say generally no. There has been a lot of effort into investigating whether waves can heat the upper atmospheres, and it's a mixed bag. It sometimes heats them, but at other times it changes the vertical slope of the temperatures such that it actually cools it down. So it's a very complicated thing. I said earlier, waves deposit energy and momentum into the upper atmosphere. So that implies, yes, they heat, but actually the heating that they produce is very low. And the most important thing is the momentum, the acceleration that they generate. So I hope that answers parts of the question at least.
Another one from inside.
Hello, and thank you very much for a fascinating talk. You mentioned the importance of gravity waves. I'm just interested to know, what is the source of those gravity waves on Titan? Is the topography sufficient to induce them? Because it seems quite a smooth surface to me.
Okay, so the surface is not smooth. There is actually topography. But you can, so a gravity wave in general is a wave that is a vertical excitation or a disturbance in the vertical sense that a particle is moved vertically from its location where it's supposed to be. So therefore the reactive force is gravity. That's why they're called gravity waves. They can be caused by basically any mechanism that disrupts their location, their vertical location. So they could be created by topography, and there is some topography certainly on Titan to take into account, but they could also be generated simply by atmospheric turbulence. So when you have a very turbulent region, from those are known to generate a lot of gravity waves. And I think the waves I showed in the simulations earlier, they are not generated by topography, but actually by effects within the atmosphere, within the stratosphere.
Another one?
There is one more here. Asking if Mars is also interesting to study.
If what is interesting?
If it's also interesting to study Mars.
What am I supposed to say? Is Mars interesting? Yes, it is.
Are there
absolutely.
any Mars people in the room?
Are there Mars
Come
people
on.
in the room? Yes, no,
Be
Mars
truthful.
is very interesting to study. I mean, it's interesting to compare Mars and Venus. Mars has a very thin atmosphere, Venus very thick. Mars and Venus have in common that they're carbon dioxide atmospheres, and they're roughly the same size. They're both close to the sun, so it's very valid to make this comparison. And in fact, one paradox is that Mars is warmer than Venus, although Venus is closer to the sun. And so just looking at the upper atmosphere, Mars it's very interesting. It has to do with carbon dioxide cooling and the densities of atomic oxygen, which excites this cooling. But so first of all, Mars is interesting because you compare it to Venus. And secondly, it's also interesting because it is a lower gravity environment. It's a thinner atmosphere, so escape becomes very important more important on Mars than on Venus. And so that's one of the main science questions that the NASA MAVEN spacecraft is looking at, the escape, the atmospheric loss mechanism. And that tells us about the history of Mars. Why does Mars have so little atmosphere now compared with Venus and compared with Earth? Because ultimately they were all formed at the same time, and they all three had CO2 atmospheres, and they developed in totally different directions. So Mars is absolutely interesting.
So
Yeah.
you were able to convince yourself as well.
I convinced myself. Yeah.
We're going to have one final question from in the room. Yeah.
Sorry if this is kind of a basic question since I'm only in year 12, but you mentioned that Venus, the magnetosphere isn't present. Is that just because it's not got like a magnetic core?
Yes.
And also, how does like the Rayleigh friction and the solar waves and just the winds in general, how do they like interact?
Okay, so first of all, it doesn't have a magnetosphere because it doesn't have a magnetic field. And as the solar wind comes onto Venus, it sort of presses upon the ionosphere, and then that creates a sort of induced magnetic field. So there is a little bit of a very thin magnetosphere, but not sustained by an internal magnetic field. The turbulence that I showed earlier, this friction, is a purely atmospheric process, and this has nothing to do with the solar wind. So the solar wind, it never really enters the Venus atmosphere. It sort of also gets deflected around, albeit much closer to the planet because the planet doesn't have its own magnetic field. But it doesn't really enter substantially enter the upper atmosphere. And the friction that I mentioned is basically due to turbulence, due to gravity waves and other waves in the atmosphere. And so the turbulence is driven from within the atmosphere. And compared with the atmosphere, the solar wind density is much lower anyway. So the solar wind doesn't really drive any waves or anything in the atmosphere.
So with the stuff that's like stopping it from getting in the atmosphere, is that stuff that's just like polarizing the waves?
What prevents the solar wind from entering the atmosphere? Yeah. Well, it's the ionosphere. Because the ionosphere is basically a current layer, so it's a plasma layer where currents can flow.
So it gets absorbed, the energy?
No, it basically, through complicated current systems, the atmosphere creates an induced magnetic field, which counteracts the solar wind. So in a way, it says, stop, you're not getting any further. Without an ionosphere, it would just penetrate through. But because we have an ionosphere on Venus, and it doesn't get any it does get put off. It never enters closer than the ionosphere. I mean, this is a super interesting field of research, and people have investigated how much the solar wind enters on the day side and on the night side, and all these kind of things. It's a very interesting question. But yeah, I don't know, did I answer more or less?
So I think we've made you work for your professorship.
Okay, thank you. So it stops now, right? I don't have to do anything more?
You do have to stand there for a short while,
Okay.
because we've asked a long-standing colleague and mentor of yours, Michael Mandillo. He's going to give the vote of thanks. So Michael is online. He was unable to join us. There you are, Michael. Hello.
Oh,
Sorry.
he's
Michael,
muted.
you're on mute.
That's not a good place to be for a commentator. Okay, is that working better?
Perfect.
Are we all set?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Well, thank you, Professor Mueller-Wodarg, for a truly fascinating presentation. You bring and indeed champion a global perspective to the study of planetary atmospheres. The physical properties of an atmosphere and the processes that govern them have traditionally been described using vertical physics and chemistry. A column of gas is not rigid. And so as you've explained first with your terrestrial models when you were doing your PhD at UCL, and then of course for all of your GCM modeling studies done at Imperial, you've explained the role of horizontal transport and the nuances of auroral heating. So we are now approaching the ability to achieve for some of the other planets what we understand at Earth. But we're not there yet. And so one of the great mysteries is, why should a technique of a global circulation model that works so well at Earth have such troubles when we're at 10 astronomical units versus 1? We understand the difference in solar heating between 1 AU and 10 AU, but what your modeling has shown us is that the complexities of auroral heating and the dynamics and electrodynamics that follow from that auroral heating has greatly changed our understanding of magnetosphere, ionosphere, solar terrestrial, solar planetary relations. And you're, if not unique in the world, certainly one of the leading experts on how to address the problem using that particular format of GCMs. You do this, as we've seen today, with a wonderful ability to explain the results to both technical and lay audiences. You often coin a new phrase like the energy crisis that happens on the giant planets that you mentioned today. And used Saturn, I think, very effectively to portray the areas of work that have been done, but the vast amount of work that still has to be done with other giant planets and the implications for extraterrestrial planets, both close to their stars and further away. Let me conclude by mentioning the important influence of your career upon students and young professionals. I have seen from firsthand visits here that you have guided undergraduate and graduate students, first at UCL, occasionally at Boston University when you visit, and for many years here at Imperial. Your effects have been tireless in helping international students navigate science curricula, independent research, and the social aspects of studying in a away-from-home environment. It is a pleasure and certainly an honor to take part and to give applause and recognition of your elevation to a professorship. Congratulations, Professor. Well done.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much, Michael. So, all it is left with us to do now is to go out and celebrate with you. Oh, clearly other people are excited. Good. So we have some drinks outside, but before I let you go, can we just give Ingo a final round of thanks for a fantastic lecture?
Thank you. I would like to thank you all in the room and online, and I also want to acknowledge the organizers, Lido and Meg, who have put this event together, and of course the whole technical team back there operating cameras and voice and computers. So huge thanks to everybody who supported this. Thank you.
So, just up there.
Sorry for the first question. I don't understand it. I have it here. No, I have it. I just took a screenshot. I just have to. I don't understand it. But the guy asked it a long time ago, so I was feeling bad for him not to ask that one. And I only have 3 at that time, so.